In May 2008, the UN Division for the Advancement of Women, in collaboration with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, organised an expert group meeting on good practices and legislation on violence against women. The outcome of that expert group meeting was a model framework for legislation on violence against women, which contains both general recommendations for legislation on all forms of violence against women and also specific recommendations in relation to domestic violence and sexual violence. In this video, we will provide an overview of the key recommendations contained in the model framework, and we will also highlight the specific recommendations on domestic violence and on sexual violence. As you watch this video, you may want to refer to the framework, which is available on the website of the Division of Advancement of Women, right next to this video. My name is Imrana Jalal. I'm the Gender and Human Rights Advisor to the Pacific Regional Rights Resource Team and was the chairperson of the expert group meeting.
My name is Cheryl Thomas. I am the director of the Women's Human Rights Program at the Advocates for Human Rights in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are the creator of the Stop Violence Against Women website, and I was the rapporteur at the expert group meeting in Vienna in May 2008.
Cheryl, perhaps we could start with a brief overview of the nature of the framework. Tell us a bit about it.
Sure.
Generally.
The framework came out of the sharing of knowledge and experiences of 15 experts from around the world. Every region was represented: Asia, Africa, South America, the United States, Europe. We came together to share our knowledge and experiences and provide information about recent laws that have been passed on violence against women, and then also long-standing laws, to share experiences about how those laws have been implemented and learn from those. We developed this framework as a tool for those all around the world who have embarked on drafting, implementing, and then, after the laws have passed, changing and amending the laws.
Cheryl, does the framework make suggestions on the general issues, like, what are the general recommendations it makes in relation to all forms of violence?
Right, it does. It has a whole section on standards and recommendations that apply to all kinds of laws on violence against women. Mm-hmm. And so the focus, the substantive focus, becomes then domestic violence and sexual assault. But as we say, there are all these general recommendations also. And they are very specific in their recommendation that the laws provide a human rights framework, a human rights approach. So, in other words, sending the message that these laws are not granting some kind of privilege to women, but enforce the fundamental human right of a woman to be free from violence. Also, those general recommendations focus on the need for comprehensive legislation, not just a brief amendment to a criminal code provision, but a very kind of comprehensive, overarching view of violence against women that talks about the need for prevention, for education, for training, for services for victims of violence and survivors of violence. And then also, of course, the specific recommendations in the laws regarding criminal and civil provisions that hold offenders very clearly accountable for violence against women and protect victim safety.
And one of the innovative things about this framework, Cheryl, is that it actually suggests that the legislation should contain preventative measures. Now, how might this look? What might that look like in legislation?
The expert group was very clear about the need for the law to contain actual language about preventative measures, as you say, Imrana. And that might look, a variety of things are very important in prevention of violence against women. It's public awareness campaigns, really tackling the fundamental roots of violence, causes of violence against women by getting out there and addressing biases in the public. Training programs for those on the front lines of law enforcement is very important. Legislation, the framework is clear in its recommendation that legislation should provide all those kinds of strategies that really aim at preventing violence against women, not just addressing it after it's happened.
So in fact, legislation is the framework suggests that you've got to attack the root cause of violence,
right.
not just how to
Right.
punish people and so
Right.
on.
The educational curricula
That's
in
right.
the society, the way the media
Yeah.
addresses violence against women and might perpetuate the
Yes.
kind of biases that lead to violence against women.
Okay. What about the issue of empowerment? One of the suggestions in the framework is that the legislation should focus also on the empowerment of the victim survivor.
Right.
What sort of examples might we suggest in that area?
Well, the framework makes clear that one of the root causes of violence against women is economic inequality and disempowerment. And there are several aspects of the framework throughout in the general part and also in the two specific sections on domestic violence and sexual assault about the need to address that, to provide public assistance and financial support for victims of violence, to provide funding for shelters and hotlines and services so that victim survivors can feel empowered to leave an abusive situation.
Cheryl, in the past, as we know, there are many good laws that are passed, but have subsequently not been implemented. Is there anything in the framework that suggests how we might deal with that problem?
Yeah, you're very right about that. There are laws around the world and that have been passed, many recently in the last 5 to 10 years, that are sitting on the books. And they are not being really effectively implemented to protect victim safety and ensure accountability for offenders. And advocates and officials have acknowledged this and recognized this, and this was very much a part of the discussion of the experts at the expert meeting and is reflected in the framework, that there just has to be provisions in actual legislation that assure that implementation is going to happen, so that there's monitoring that's done of the law very quickly after it's passed in a parliament, and that there's training for those who are responsible for implementing the law, the police, the prosecutors, the judges, so that there's a really very clear commitment that the law won't just sit on the books, that it will be effectively implemented. And that should be right in the law. That language should be right in the law.
What about the development of the law? Who ought to be consulted?
You know, this is a really important point to think about for anyone who endeavors to start a legal reform process in their country, that before any language is put down on paper, that there be a very focused effort on gathering the stakeholders in the community, those who will be affected by this law in every way. So at the top of the list, of course, victim survivors. Those who have suffered violence against women ought to be part of the process from the very beginning, before any drafting is started. But then also, of course, police and prosecutors and judges and service providers and medical providers. Each of those different parties in a community bring a unique perspective and a needed perspective. And without that, it will be difficult to have a law where there's buy-in, where people, once the law is passed, feel like they can and will have the will to really make the effort to implement it.
And of course that also brings a sense of ownership to people.
Exactly.
This is our law, we created it,
Exactly.
we own it, and we're going to make it work.
Exactly.
And finally, on this particular element of the framework, Cheryl, I know in the Pacific, certainly where our project is based, the RRT project, we're going to use the framework in a very practical way. We will take that framework and we will try to adapt it and use it to the local contexts in Pacific Island countries. And our legislative advocacy groups in the 6 countries will use the framework to develop locally modified laws.
That's exactly, I
What
think,
about,
how we
do
intend.
you know of any countries that are going to be using the framework?
Yes, I do, and the example you describe is exactly, I think, what we intended when the 15 of us came together and created it. I was recently in Morocco, and there they have translated the recommendations of the framework. The framework has a discussion piece and then concludes with very concrete recommendations for all of these issues we've been talking about. And a group of NGOs there who want to begin the legal reform process there, have translated those recommendations into Arabic, and they have delivered the recommendations to the ministry that is responsible for the actual writing and drafting of the law, and those recommendations have become a focal point for the discussions that are happening, the substantive discussions that are happening now between the civil society NGO community and these government officials.
Fantastic, and I hope that it develops that way in the Pacific as well. Thank you.
Right.